Good evening. I'm Alistair Cook. I've been brought here tonight on behalf of the Arterburn Family Heritage Foundation to spend this time in the Masterpiece Theater Hour to talk about the 2020 annual Boxing Day competition. I've been paid a great sums of money and many pots of petunias to provide this service for the family. And as such, I would like to simply walk through some of the general requirements and then give you a quick synopsis of the history so as to provide a little bit of a leg up and easier understanding of the requirements as they are. First and foremost, I am not Alistair Cook. Got that out of the way. Second, you've received a packet. If you're listening to this and watching this, you've received a packet in the mail, an official invitation to participate. There you were welcomed with great fanfare by our judge this year, the great and illustrious Professor Aloysius Bartholomew Marvel Esquire. And through that participation invitation, you have been asked to participate if you would like. No pressure if you would prefer not to. But if you do, there could be great wealth and great notoriety brought to you. And in that participation invitation, there are enclosed several pieces of documentation that you need to pay careful attention to. The first being the official participant rules. The rules outline very simply what is required of you and what needs to be done. You will notice in the rules, the very first thing is that you must read the Historical Archive File 3224 Revision J. It is with that file where the history of Boxing Day and as it pertains to the Arterburn family and the heritage of Flippin, Kentucky, as to why this is what it is. So please do so. I will spend a little bit of time and provide a synopsis of that history after we get through the rules. Second, you'll notice that as part of the rules, there is a requirement to complete an enrollment form. The enrollment form, the official participant enrollment form, allows you to participate as individuals or as groups or as an entire household. So for example, if you are a household of 5 and wish to break down children and parents, or boys and girls, or however you would like to do that in your family, or as individuals, you may enter each person independently or you may enter them as groups. Simply follow the enrollment form. Additionally, there's an affidavit you must complete, which requires your date of birth, your favorite color, your height, your favorite song, your latitude and longitude, and your contact information by way of cell phone number and email address. In addition, pets may apply and can be included in the participation if you so wish. And if you'd like to do that, there is a place in the enrollment form to name them as well. And in this case, it's very important that you fill out the form properly when it comes to who in the family does the dog or cat most look like. On the last page of the enrollment form is a place for a facsimile of what you actually look like to make sure that it's you. This will go down in family history and be archived for all time. You are required to draw in ink. Each one of you must draw your own picture, your own self-portrait, if you will, and identify yourself as is needed. And then the eldest member of the household is required to sign. Please follow the enrollment form. In addition to the enrollment form, then, is what we mentioned at the beginning, which is the Historical Archives File 3224 Rev J. Please do read this. I will briefly walk through this in a higher level as a quick short story rather than the long drawn out history that it really is. But it's important that you do so. There's much information there, including photographs of previous and current family members and telltale signs of why we do this. And so with regard to the Historical Archives File 3224 Revision J, there is history that talks to Boxing Day as being a European tradition, the day after Christmas. Don't believe it. The day after Christmas is appropriate, but the tradition of giving gifts to servants and so forth was just another way to re-gift ugly sweaters. So don't believe it. There's much more to Boxing Day, especially with concerns the Arterburns and southern Kentucky. And the story is told in the historical archive document that you must read. The synopsis is that in a place west of the Walker's Cumberland Gap, somewhere in mid-October, 4 people came across the crossroads, one from each different direction. There was a man by the name of Bill Brockett, a postman by trade and a doctor by calling, and he had been traveling from the burg of Pikesville. He was heading northwest, intent on delivering the mail. A second man, Jim the Falconer, who was an owner-operator of a grist mill and tavern near Green River, was traveling northeast, and he had left his home in a hurry and in an effort to avoid the hangman's noose, as well as collection of the $10 he owed the father of his discarded wife as repayment for the dowry cow which he had sold for cold hard cash. A third man, a Mr. McAdoo Flippin, a.k.a. Wackadoo McAdoo, claimed to be a Baptist minister and was on his way from Louisville, was traveling southwest, looking to rehabilitate the great unwashed of the deep south. He was, suspiciously, traveling with a wagon that purported great feats of mystery and magic, and had a label on the side of Professor Marvel. The fourth traveler was a woman by the name of Miss Manning. She was traveling to the southeast, claiming to be a school teacher, and stating that her only care was to impart the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, to the poor barefoot children of Kentucky. As they stood steadfast at the crossroads, each with some form of a past that they were trying to escape, looked at each other, weary of crossing one another or passing one another, and sat there in dead stillness. The postman, Bill Brockett, made the first move. And as soon as he did, the woman had drawn a gun on him and said, "Wait a minute there. You're not going anywhere." And as she held the gun, shakingly pointing it at the poor, portly postman, the Baptist minister immediately interjected with, "Madam, unless I am monumentally misconstrue this moment of inconspicuously conspicuous, fortunately unfortunate, or simplistically simple, I do endeavor that it is individually incumbent upon each of us to gracefully and alternately acquiesce our names and intended business before our plumping poor postman is persuaded to deny his duty and hightail it out of here." And with that he introduced himself as McAdoo Flippin, at your service. A man true of word, sleight of hand, and precocious profundity. And he was on his way running from a town just to the north where he had sold the Scots who lived there a bill of goods, all in good faith, of course. And then the third man, Jim, turned to her and said, "Well, my name's Jim, ma'am, and I'm just trying to get away, Green River." And she said, "What's the hurry?" And of course he explained that how he was held at gunpoint to marry the town butcher's daughter, which he reluctantly agreed on account of the gun primarily, but also due to the fact that the butcher offered up a large Hereford cow as dowry. He went on to explain that the girl was kind and all. She was comely of shape, but she was ugly from the front, had freckles on her butt, and preferred to sleep with the hogs pinned up behind the butcher shop. He went on to claim that there is simply nothing a man can do to overcome the terrible and lingering stench of pigs. So he sold the cow, cleared the cash drawer from his tavern, packed up a single sack of milled sorghum, and set out for the Smoky Mountains in the east. At this point, Miss Manning had the gun still pointing at the postman and said, "So, what's your story?" And he said, "Well, my name's Bill Brockett, ma'am." "And so you're a postman?" He says, "Yes, I am. I'm a postman for Pikesville, and I deliver to all the farms and towns in this area, ma'am. I really need to go." And she made a joke about upcoming snowstorm, and of course he bashedly said, "No, it's not going to snow, I don't think." She laughed. Everybody laughed, thought it was funny. Well, the poor guy. He went on to explain that his mail route brings him to all the homes and towns in the area, and usually during the day. He further explained that during the day, while the men were out in the fields, he couldn't help but notice that the women left at home seemed quite lonely, if not somewhat desperate for company. He said he never meant for this sort of thing to happen, but he's now fairly convinced that a good quarter of the children along his route are actually his own children. And of course, Miss Manning fell out of her saddle laughing. And there we have it. There's where the four of them are. But what about Miss Manning? Well, she explained her position as well once she relaxed. She put her revolver in the holster, and then told her own story, in which she said, "Well, my name's Miss Manning, and I'm better known as May Lily." And she was actually an infamous sharpshooter and equestrian of great erudition. And she had been working with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and she had separated them from their deepest pleasures, that being the show's payroll. At which point she boldly set up and said, "Women's rights." She was on the run as well. So with that, they all sat looking across the crossroads at one another, trying to figure out what to do, when the professor, the Baptist minister, flippin', wackadoo mackadoo, said, "Well, we're going to have to come up with something here, guys." And so what he did is he gave some ideas to them all. He looked towards young Miss Manning and young Jim and said, "I think you, Miss Manning, taking the role of a school teacher and looking as you do, I believe you could actually succeed as a good school teacher. And therefore, let me draft up the documentation for a price, of course, and provide you with the needed documentation, diplomas and accreditations to move forward in your life as a school teacher, and use that as your alibi and escape the past." And she was all about that. And of course, the professor began to draft those documents up. Along the way, he looked at Jim and said, "I think the two of you need to be married." And she said, "What?" And he said, "What?" And they weren't too sure about that. Kind of looked at each other and got kind of shy and turned red. And then they began to kind of eyeball each other and think, "Well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. I don't know. You're kind of cute. Well, you're kind of handsome." And so as they considered it, the professor asked Jim what his real name was. Instead of Jim the Falconer, what is his name? But nobody knew his name. In fact, Jim didn't even know his name. He's only been known as Jim the Falconer. So the professor went on to name him and give him a new name, a new birthright, and decided to call him Mr. James Burton Turner, and to which the whole group thought was just a great name and kind of like a birth date for him, and they decided that that's his name from now on. He also decided to name Miss Manning and give her a new name, and her name would be, going forward, would be Mary Elizabeth Bartholomew of Greene County. And the professor tried to call her Hattie, but for some reason he had Hattie stuck in his mind and couldn't quite get it through his head. But he went along with the whole idea of Mary Elizabeth Bartholomew. And so there you have it. He went on to talk to them about getting married and said, "Well, it's a good cover, and the two of you, since Jim wants to go to the Smoky Mountains, and there's great need for schooling in Appalachia, it's a great opportunity for Miss Manning, for Miss Mary Elizabeth Bartholomew to utilize her skills in that case. And as such, traveling as a married couple would be much safer, much better alibi, and much easier to establish a school and work and whatnot in the Appalachia." So they agreed. So the professor dubbed them married, filled out all the various documentation, provided all that sort of thing to them, and declared them married then and there. And everybody applauded, thought that was great. After that, he looked to the Bill Brockett, and thinking, what can I do with Bill? And he says, your problem, Bill, is that you run this route, this mail route, and it seems to have done nothing but get you in trouble. And I'm sure that you're busy hiding and running and keeping an eye out over your shoulder for the farmers who know that you've been fooling around with their wives, and so we need to get you off of this route. And of course, Bill Brockett said, well, you know, who's going to deliver the mail? And the professor said, well, how about we promote you to being the postmaster for the area? Not just the postman, but the general postmaster. And of course, nobody was going to promote Bill Brockett. And the professor said, nobody's going to know. I'll fill out the documentation. I'll give you all the papers and all the accreditations and a plaque to hang on your wall, and we'll go that route. And so Bill thought, well, that's pretty good, but then who's going to deliver the mail? And the professor said, well, I'll deliver the mail. I'll take this upon myself. And I will be sure that when you want to see one of your many wives or many children, that we arrange some sort of agreement where you can meet them and not be in such trouble or so conspicuous as you check on the doings of the new mailman, new postman in the area. And so Bill thought, well, what do you know? I think that might be a good idea. And so with that, the postmaster stated very clearly, the professor stated very clearly through a decree that the Postmaster General of the United States of America had put together a great document recognizing the service to the community and to men and women alike by Bill Brockett, and granted full responsibility and relative recourse for rural mail delivery and tax collection through the entire area in and around Pikesville, now so named and announced herein as Postmaster Extraordinaire. And with that came a large plaque, which Bill took back with him and declared forevermore to be Postmaster General. Now the trouble was the professor needed a good alibi as well. And if he was going to be a postmaster for that area, he needed to actually live in that area. Therefore, he needed land. And he thought he'd come to the end of his elucidations of his ideas by thinking, well, I don't have land. What am I going to do? When Bill said, well, you know, Mr. Flippin, Professor, sir, I own land. In fact, I own this land we're on right now, this crossroads, right here by Indian Creek. I own this crossroads. And I will sell it to you for a song, for all the wonderful things you've done for me and for these people here, and to help us clear our path here. I will sell you this, and you can set down roots right here, if you will. And so the professor thought, well, what do you know? That'll work just great. I'll be the local postmaster, or local postman. You'll be the local postmaster. We can let Mr. and Mrs. Turner, as it would, move on their way, and I think we're done with this. I think we're in good shape. However, it's about this point where Jim Turner, Jim the Falconer, turns to the professor and says, "Oh, wait a minute. What about my wife's father? What am I going to do about that? They catch me, they're going to hang me and anybody with me." And so the postman or the professor says, "Well, you know, I have an idea. Let me think about it for a minute." So he thought about it for a minute, and he said he looks through the post. And this is where the Boxing Day information comes in very, very precisely. So pay close attention and make sure you read the history. But this is where the professor turns to the postman and says, "Mr. Brockett, do you have a box that we could use?" And Mr. Brockett kind of looks and says, "Well, I have this hat box that I got from the haberdashery specifically for Miss Mavis Maple that, you know, I'm going to deliver to. She's one of my girls. You can't have this box or the hat in it." And the professor said, "Well, I will deliver the hat to her if you'll just give us the box. I'll keep the hat clean, and I promise Miss Mavis will have this hat along with all your loving words and kindnesses. Just give me the box so that we can take care of Mr. Turner." And so he reluctantly gave him the box and the hat, and the professor put the hat away. And as he looked at the box, he began to scratch his head, and he looked to Miss Turner, Miss Manning, as she used to be called, and temporarily there for a little bit, whatever we called her, Miss Elizabeth, Mary Elizabeth Bartholomew. He looked to her and said, "Come with me, I need your help." And they go into his wagon, and all this noise begins to go on. And they're just not, you hear all this noise, and outside is Bill and Jim. And to hear this noise going on, they're beginning to wonder what is going on in there. And Jim's like, well, that's my wife now. And he's getting upset thinking the professor's doing something he shouldn't be doing. And about that time, they come out with this beautiful box. And now the box is eloquently wrapped with beautiful papers, beautiful ribbons, and just is astoundingly gorgeous. Perfectly done. A repurposed box, a hat box, used to be wrapped up and made beautiful. Miss Manning, Mrs. Turner, gave the box to the two men outside and said, open it up, take a look. And as they did, out wafted this wonderful smell of lilacs. And like, oh, it smells good, it's pretty. Oh, and as they look into the box, they find a beautiful piece of paper with golden gild around the edges and fancily handwritten, beautiful wording and eloquence of all kinds, and using the professor's type of words, as you see throughout the history document when you read it itself. You see his extensive use of alliteration. So in that paper, it flatters the daughter. It's because this box is going to be used to send to the daughter to make up for Jim leaving the daughter and stealing the cow. And so that piece of paper flatters the daughter and explains to the father that he will forever pay, as long as she's alive, every year he will pay her $10 in alimony, and enclosed, and that will come at the very end of the year, right after Christmas. And right now there's a $10 bill in the box. Right now there's a $10 bill for the father to pay back for the cost of the cow that he stole and sold. And so the document then explains all this wonderful things. Salves the daughter's broken heart, makes her feel special with something beautiful, makes her feel that he really cared but had to move on for good reason, and takes care of the father by paying him back for the cow, and tells the girl that not to worry, you'll get $10 every year and everything will be good. And in the box as well as a crisp $10 bill. As they removed the letter and they removed the $10 bill, what they found left was a perfect pot of petunias. Beautiful petunias in a small little pot. And Jim the falconer looks at the professor and says, well, what's with the flowers, Professor? The professor says, well, you have to flatter the daughter. You have to give her something to think, oh, petunias. And at that moment, everything was good. And they thought, well, you know, I think you actually have something here. What do you know? And so with that, they all kind of looked at each other and thought, well, I think we can actually do this. And so they made an agreement that this is what they were going to do. The postman was going to sell the professor land. The professor set up all the documents for name changes, marriage, and for the documents that went into the box. The Mrs. Turner helped him decorate the box to send back through the postman, now the professor, back to Green County for the daughter and the father, and to get Jim off of the hook with those guys. And Jim and Miss Manning, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, took off to Appalachia. And the postman went back to Pikesville, declared himself as postmaster extraordinaire, hung his plaque on the wall, and started telling everybody there's a new postman in what is now known as the unincorporated town of Flippin, Kentucky, where Mr. McAdoo Flippin now lives, aka the professor. And it appeared that everything was good and fine. So as time went on, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, Jim and Mary, May, and Miss Manning, they went on to open one of the first schools for the deaf in Appalachia. They raised a huge family, all of whom were profoundly educated and lavishly literate. Their presence can be seen throughout the years and still today. Ted Turner is actually a descendant of Mr. and Mrs. Turner. The Ted Turner, as you know. So they did very well by themselves. Bill Brockett, of course, did very well indeed, as going back and becoming postmaster extraordinaire and postmaster general of the area. as that occurred, and he began to pronounce himself as postmaster extraordinaire, he had all kinds of young women begin to show up and show interest in him. And his interests into the women that were the farmers' wives who he had fathered so many children with began to kind of go their own way and get back to normal work days and normal families. And Bill Brockett stopped going to see them. In fact, he married and moved on. He eventually ended up in Texas. And so, oddly enough, this is the connection to our family. So, it is a fact that Bill Brockett did indeed sire a few Arterburns during his wayward wanderings along his particular postal route. In fact, our own Frances Ann Julia Thomason Arterburn, the wife of Samuel Patton Arterburn, with her firstborn, was quite insistent that her first child, a son, was to be aptly named after the postman, a doctor as it were. That doctor being Bill Brockett. And so one of our ancestors is actually named William E.C. Brockett Arterburn. And the records indicate that indeed he was named for Dr. William C. Brockett, local physician, postmaster, fellow Methodist, and family friend in Pikesville and Flippin, Monroe County, Kentucky. So we have this connection, as you see. The professor, Mr. McAdoo Flippin, he actually did set down roots in Flippin and lived there for a long, long time. He built the post office that's there today. The post office that, if you've been into the crossroads, you've seen. To the catty corner to the south east of my Grandpa Gus's gas station. So McAdoo actually built that. He still has his traveling medicine show wagon stashed in a barn out back, actually in a cotton shed, I think. And he kept that for many years in case he needed to escape for some reason, should somebody catch up with him from his bad misdoings in the past. But the interesting thing was, and he wasn't, everybody referred to him as professor, but he was in fact not a professor at all. But through his wiles of wisdom and marvelous magic, he persuaded the local sorghum farmers to actually switch their crop to tobacco, and that gave him a foothold on commerce there by providing seed and other commerce associated with the tobacco crops and family. So that was good. So he lived to be an old man and then disappeared. Nobody really knew what became of him. He's believed to still actually be living this 170 years or so later somewhere, and that he can still be found out there writing nonsense, crafting lengthy stories of sarcasm, and selling snake oil and things like that. He's probably associated with the family somewhere. So where is all this leading, you ask? What is this thing about Boxing Day? Obviously, the professor helped these guys put a box together to send off to the girl and her father to take care of the cow. And it was a beautiful and ornate box filled with petunias and a golden paper and a $10 bill and wonderful smelling stuff. Well, there's a little bit more to it, So the professor took his role very seriously in holding up the promise of Jim Turner. And so every year, the day after Christmas, he would repurpose a Christmas box and would decorate and ribbon the box, add a tag that was beautiful, pin a polite receipt for the annual alimony payment, securely slide in a $10 bill, and lovingly lay a lilac scent throughout. And of course, he would put a beautiful pot of petunias, live or dried petunias depending on the seasons, and put that into the box and deliver that every year, right as rain. And all the locals, including our family, who most of the locals were our family, the Arterburns, they saw this going on and, watched how diligent the professor did this. And they thought, oh, what do you know? And they understood the story. They began to understand the story year after year. I was like, well, what's that all about? What's he doing that for? And they began to come to understand the whole story of the crossroads, and they kept it to themselves and thought, wow, this is interesting. So the professor remained responsible to this for all the days that the girl was alive. And she made it about 17 years. And she died one day of ptomaine poisoning, unfortunately, after having dinner with too many pigs and sleeping with a bunch of them and having claimed that she had hugged 100 hogs. They found her dead. So, which was sad, but the professor at that point was no longer indebted to her father or her, and no longer would do the box any longer. Now everybody knew about this, of course, as I mentioned, and after she had passed away, and she was disinfected and dried and inoculated and buried, as Christmas came around, many of the families there, primarily our family, found it quite interesting to tease the professor, knowing the truth of what had really happened, but never really opening up to tell anyone the truth. And so the way they would tease the professor is they, then, our family, would repurpose a Christmas box, wrap it wonderfully with lots of paper and lots of ribbon, include a $10 bill, and they usually were fabricated because we were very poor people, and they would write a beautiful essay and trying to write in the ways of the professor, right, with all the eloquence and alliteration and all the ridiculous overstressed language as they could possibly muster, and put all that together and then provide a little pot of petunias and put that into the box. And on the day after Christmas, they would deliver them to the post office where the professor lived. So here they were making fun of the professor, but the professor, being wily, wise man that he was, actually took to gathering up all the boxes, very carefully opening them, smelling them, reading the language that was in the letter, checking out the $10 bill, and in particular the pot of petunias. And then he would grade them, and he would acclaim one of them as the winner of the Boxing Day competition for their particular entry on his porch, as it were. And this unofficially started the Boxing Day tradition with our family, with this type of box of petunias. The professor then would turn around and decry the official winner and present them with a perfectly proper pot of petunias and other elaborations, as it would be. So, as history would have it, and it doesn't because no one seemed inclined to write it down, the Arterburn family farmers were quite a competitive clan and managed to marvel the professor with their decorating skills and their grandiose grammar and their liquidatious literacy year after year. In fact, it's rumored that throughout the Flippin area and throughout time that the Arterburns actually acquired and maintained more than 100 pots of petunias in a cotton shed on their property from prize winnings from the professor over the years. No one's ever found the cotton shed where they were stored. They believed it was burned down by a couple of Arterburn boys in the 1920s, smoking cigars behind the cotton shed. I think I know who those two were. Probably my dad and Uncle Bart. In any case, there is a telltale sign. For those of you who have been to the Arterburn homestead with Uncle Mike back in the day, and in the photo journal that came with the history that is in your participant package, there's a photograph of the inside wall of the Arterburn homestead with our cousin Ken picking wallpaper off the inside of the house that wallpaper being nothing more than purple petunias. This is testimony to the fact that the Arterburns were deeply indebted to this whole process, thought it was a wonderful thing, and did this many, many times over. So, and that's the way it works. That's what this whole thing's all about. So, that's the way the whole thing came down. Now, believe it or not, it's actually true. If you go through and look at the history, read that carefully, and you look at the photo journal that's attached to it, and the documentation that's within that photo journal, you will come to the realization that what I speak is the truth. So it is the charter of the Arterburn Family Heritage Foundation this year going forward to continue with this tradition. It is by the virtue of perfunctorily proven science, provoked neither by cause nor reason, but by blood, that the Arterburn Family Heritage Foundation so strikingly and insistently instruct and inform denoted descendants in discerning the divinations of perpetuity regarding the true meaning and history of Boxing Day, and the plain and purple purpose of a perfect pot of petunias. In fact, the foundation faithfully fulfills its fabricated fortunes through an ongoing ornery onslaught of borrowing and bestowing Boxing Day traditions and trappings for all future and present generations of Arterburns, wherever so they may be. Please read. Please fill out your enrollment forms. If you have any questions, you know who to call. Good night.